Oh, hello there. I'm Belchen, a cute bear. In this class, I'll read to all of you. Chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby.
Ass.
Oh. The Great Gatsby. I've Scott Fitzgerald. Chapter 7. It was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in his house failed to go on one Saturday night, and as obscurely as it had begun, his career as Tramuccio was over. Only gradually did I become aware that the automobiles which turned expectantly into his drive stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. Wondering if he was sick, I went over to find out an unfamiliar butler with a villainous face squinted at me suspiciously from the door. "Is Mr. up?" After a pause, he added, "Sir," in a dilatory, bridging way. I hadn't seen him around, and I was rather worried. "Tell him, Mr. Who?" he demanded rudely. "Carway." "All right." Abruptly, he slammed the door. My friend informed me that Gatsby had dismissed every servant in his house a week ago and replaced them with half a dozen others, who never went into Westwick Village to be bribed by the tradesmen, but ordered moderate supplies over the telephone. The grocery boy reported that the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and the general opinion in the village was that the new people weren't servants at all. Next day, Gatsby called me on the phone. "Going away?" I inquired. "No. I wanted somebody who wouldn't gossip." So the whole caravansary had fallen in like a card house at the disapproval inn. Her eyes. There's some people Wolf she wanted to do something for. They're all brothers and sisters. He was calling up at Daisy's request told I come to lunch at her house tomorrow. Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned and seemed relieved to find that I was calling. Something was up. And yet I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a skinny, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined in the garden. The next day was broiling. Almost the last. Certainly the warmest of the summer. As my train emerged from the tunnel into sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. The store seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist. And then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into defeat with a desolate cry. Her pocketbook slapped to the floor. "Well, why?" she gasped. I picked it up with a worried bend and handed it back to her, holding it at arm's length and by the extreme tip of the corners to indicate that I had no designs upon it, but everyone nearby, including the woman, suspected me just the same. "Hot," said the conductor to familiar faces. "Some weather. Hot. 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 Is it hot enough for you? Is it hot?" My commutation ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in the seat whose flushed lips he kissed. His head made damp the pyjama pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as we waited. At the door, the master's body poured the butler into the mouthpiece. "I'm sorry, my dad." What he really said was, he set down the receiver and came toward us, glistening slightly, to take our stiff straw hats. "Madam expects you in the salon," he cried, needlessly indicating the direction. In this heat of extra gesture was an affront to the coming store of life. The room, shadowed well with awnings, was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch, like silver idols weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. "We can't move," they said together. Jordan's fingers, padded white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. And Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the athlete, I inquired. Simultaneously I heard his voice, proft, muffled, ST, at the hall telephone. Gatsby stood in the centre of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed. Her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. "The rumour is," whispered Jordan. We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. "Very well. Then, I won't sell you the car at all. I'm under no obligations to you at all, unless for your bothering me about it at lunchtime." Holding down the receiver, said Daisy cynically. "No. He's not," I assured her. "It's a bona fide deal." Tom flung open the door, blocked out its space for a moment with his thick body, and hurried into the room. "Mr. Gatsby," he put out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. "I'm glad to see you." "Make us a cold drink," cried Daisy. As he left the room again, she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. "You know I love you," she murmured. "You forget there's a lady present," said Jordan. Daisy looked round doubtfully. "What a low." "I don't care," cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch just as a freshly laundered nurse leading a little girl came into the room. "Will the precise," she grinned, holding out her arms. The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. The bull the precise. "Did mother get powder on your old jewellery here?" "Stand up now." Gatsby and I in turn leaned down and took the small reluctant hand. Afterward he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before. "I got dressed before luncheon," said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy. "That's because your mother wanted to show you off." Her face bent into the single wrinkle of the small white neck. "You dream." "Do?" "Yes," admitted the child calmly. "How do you like mother's friends?" Daisy turned her arms so that she faced Gatsby. "She doesn't look like her father," explained Daisy. "She looks like me." Daisy sat back upon the couch. The nurse took a step forward and held out her hand. "Goodbye." With a reluctant backward glance, the well-disciplined child held her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door, just as Tom came back, proceeding for Jim Mickey's that clicked full of ice. Gatsby took up his drink. "They certainly look cool," he said, with visible tension. We drank in long, greedy swallows. "I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year," said Tom genially. "It seems that pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun. Oh wait, Minute, it's just opposite. The sun's getting colder every year." "Come outside," he suggested to Gatsby. I went with them out to the veranda. On the green sound, stagnant in the heat, One small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dog days along shore. Slowly the white wings of the boat moved against the blue limit of the sky. Ahead lay the scalloped ocean and the abounding blessed isles. "There's sport for you," said Tom, nodding. We had luncheon in the dining room, darkened to against the heat, and drank down nervous Geety with the cold ale. "What'll we do with ourselves this afternoon?" cried Daisy. "And the day after that?" "Don't be morbid," Jordan said. "But it's so hot," insisted Daisy, on the verge of tears. "And everything's so confused." Her voice struggled on through the heat, beating against it, moulding its senselessness into forms. "I've heard of making a garage out of a stable," Tom was saying to Gatsby. "Who wants to go to town?" demanded Daisy insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her as she cried. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. "You always look so cool," she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby, and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. "You resemble the advertisement of the man," she went on innocently. "All right," broke in Tom quickly. "I'm perfectly willing to go to town." He got up, his eyes still flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. "Come on." His temper cracked a little. "What's the matter?" "Anyhow, if we're going to town." His hand, trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. Daisy's voice got a star feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. "Are we just going to go?" she objected. "Like this?" "Well, let's have fun," she begged him. He didn't answer. "Have it your own way," she said. "Come on." They went upstairs to get ready while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, changed his mind, but not before Tom wheeled and faced him expectantly. "Have you got your stables here?" asked Gatsby with an effort. A pause. "I don't see the idea of going to town," broke out Tom savagely. "Shall we take anything to drink?" called Dizzy from an upper window. "I'll get some whiskey," answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. "I can't say anything in his house." "She's got an indiscreet voice," I remarked. "It's full of—" I hesitated. "Her voice is full of money," he said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it. The jingle of it. The simple song of it high in a white palace, the king's daughter. Tom came out of the house wrapping a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan wearing small tight hats of metallic cloth and carrying light capes over their arms. "Shall we all go in my car?" suggested Gatsby. He felt the hat, cream leather of the seat. "Is this standard shift?" demanded Tom. Well, the suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby. "I don't think there's much gas," he objected. "Plenty of gas," said Tom boisterously. He looked at the gauge. "And if it runs out, I can stop at a drugstore." A pause followed this apparently pointless remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression, at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognisable, as if I had only heard it described in words, passed over Gatsby's face. "Come on," Daisy said Tom, pressing her with his hand toward Gatsby's car. He opened the door, which she moved her from the circle of his arm. "You take Nick and Jordan." She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the unfamiliar gears tentatively, and we shot off into the oppressive heat, leaving them out of sight behind. "Did you see that?" demanded Tom. He looked at me keenly, realizing that Jordan and I must have known all along. "You think I'm pretty dumb, don't you?" he suggested. "Perhaps I am, but I have almost a second sight. Sometimes. That tells me what to do. Maybe you don't believe that." He buzzed. The immediate contingency overtook him, pulled him back from the edge of theoretical abyss. "I've made a small investigation of this fellow," he continued. "Do you mean you've been to a medium?" inquired Jordan humorously. "What?" Confused. He stared at us as we laughed. "About Gatsby?" "No, I haven't." "And you found he was an Oxford man," said Jordan helpfully. "An Oxford man?" He was incredulous. "Like hell he is." "Oxford." "New Mexico," snorted Tom contemptuously. "Listen, Tom, if you're such a snob, why did you invite him to lunch?" demanded Jordan coarsely. Daisy invited him. We were all irritable now with the fading L, and aware of it we drove for a while in silence. Then as Dr. J. Ecclesberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. "We've got enough to get us to town," said Tom. "But there's a garage right here," objected Jordan. Tom threw on both brakes impatiently, and we slid to an abrupt dusty stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed hollow-eyed at the car. "Let's have some gas," cried Tom roughly. "I'm sick," said Wilson without moving. "Well, shall I help myself?" Tom demanded. With an effort, Wilson left the shade in support of the doorway and, breathing hard, unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. "I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch," he said, "but I need money pretty bad." "How you like this one?" inquired Tom. "It's a nice yellow one," said Wilson, as he strained at the handle. "Big chance," Wilson smiled faintly. "No." "What do you want money for?" "I've been here too long. I want to get away." "Your wife does?" exclaimed Tom, startled. "She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the... "Oh," shading his eyes. "And now she's going with us. She wants to or not." The coupe flashed by us with a flurry of dust and the flash of our waving hand. "What do I owe you?" demanded Tom harshly. "I just got wised up to something funny the last 2 days," remarked Wilson. "That's why I want to get away." The relentless beating heat was beginning to confuse me, and I had a bad moment. Day before, I realised that so far his suspicions hadn't alighted on Tom. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before, and it occurred to me that there was no difference between men in intelligence or race, so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty, as if he had just got some poor girl with child. "I'll let you have that car," said Tom. That locality was always vaguely disquieting, even in the broad glare of afternoon. And now I turned my head as though I had been warned of something behind. Over there sheeps the giant eyes of Dr. T. J. Eichelberg kept their vigil. But I perceived, after a moment, that their eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. In one of the windows over the garage, the curtains had been moved aside a little, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. So engrossed was she that she had no consciousness of being observed. And one emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a slowly developing picture. Her expression was curiously familiar. It was an expression I had often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realized that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. And as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot whips of panic. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitately from his control. Instinct made him step on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind. And we sped along toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour, until, among the spidery girders of the elevated, we came in sight of the easygoing Blue Cape. "Those big movies around 50th Street are cool," suggested Jordan. "I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it overripe." The word sensuous had the effect of further disquieting Tom. But before he could invent a protest, the coupe came to a stop, and Daisy signalled us to draw up alongside. "Where are we going?" she cried. "It's so hot," she complained. "You go. We'll ride around and make you after." With an effort her wit rose faintly. "We'll meet you on some corner." "We can't argue about it here," Tom said impatiently, as the truck gave out a cussing whistle behind us. "You follow me to the south side of Central Park." Several times he turned his head and looked back for their car, and if the traffic delayed them he slowed up until they came into sight. I think he was afraid they would dart down a side street and out of his life forever. But they didn't, and we all took the less explicable step of engaging the parlour of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. The prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into that room eludes me, though I have a sharp physical memory that, in the course of it, my underwear kept clamming like a damp snake around my legs and intermittent beads of sweat raced across my back. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mental lap each. I've said over and over that it was a crazy idea well talked at. Once Joe baffled Quirk and thought, or pretended to think, the room was large and stifling, and though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back dress, fixing her hair. "Is this well, sweet?" whispered Jordan respectfully, and everyone laughed. "Open another window," commanded Daisy, without turning around. "Well, the thing to do is to forget about the heat," said Tom impatiently. He unrolled the bottle of whiskey from the towel and put it on the table. Why not let her alone? Old sport, remarked Gatsby. There was a moment of silence. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed to the floor. Whereupon Jordan whispered, "Excuse me, but this time no one laughed." "I'll pick it up," I offered. "I've got it." Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered him in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. "That's a great expression of yours, isn't it?" said Tom sharply. "All this old sport business. Now see here, Tom," said Daisy, turning around from the mirror. "If you're going to make personal remarks, I won't stay here a minute." As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. "Imagine marrying anybody in this seat," cried Jordan dismally. Stilly was married in the middle of June, Daisy remembered. Louisville in June. Somebody fainted. Who was it fainted? Biloxi, he answered shortly. A man named Biloxi. Walks Biloxi. And he made boxes, so that's a fact, and he was from Biloxi. They carried him into my house, appended Jordan, because we lived just 2 doors from the church. And he stayed 3 weeks. Until Daddy told him he had to get out. The day after he left, Daddy died. After a moment, she added, "I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis," I remarked. That was his cousin. I knew his whole family history before he left. The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a long cheer floated in at the window, followed by intermittent cries of Asia, and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. "We're getting old," said Daisy. "Remember Biloxi," Jordan warned her. "Where'd you know him?" "Biloxi." He concentrated with an effort. "I didn't know him." "He was not," she denied. "I'd never seen him before." "Well, he said he knew you. He said he was raised in Louisville." Jordan smiled. "He was probably bumming his way home." Tom and I looked at each other blankly. First base. Gatsby's foot beat his shirt. Restless tattoo, and Tom eyed him suddenly. "By the way, Viste, at B, Al, S." A pause. Then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint, and I bet the silence was unbroken by his thank you and the soft closing of the door. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. "I told you I went there," said Gatsby. "I heard you. It was in 1919. I only stayed 5 months." Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his unbelief, but we were all looking at Gatsby. It was an opportunity they gave to some of the officers after the armistice, he continued. I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I experienced before. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. "Open the whiskey, Tom," she ordered, "and I'll make you a mint julep." "Wait a minute," snapped Tom. "I want to ask Mr. "Go on," Gatsby said politely. They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. "He isn't causing a row." Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. "You're causing a row." "Self-control," repeated Tom incredulously. "I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife." "Well, If that's the idea you can count me out nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. "We're all white here," murmured Jordan. "I know I'm not very popular. I don't give big parties." Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete. "I've got something to tell you." Old sport, began Gatsby, but Daisy gasped at his intention. "Please don't," she interrupted helplessly. "Please, let's all go home." "That's a good idea," I got up. "Come on." "Tom, I want to know what Mr. Your wife doesn't love you," said Gatsby. "She's never loved you." "You must be crazy," exclaimed Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. "She never loved you. Do you hear?" he cried. "She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for. It was a terrible mistake." At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive fairness that we remain as though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions. "Sit down." Daisy, Tom's face groped unsuccessfully for the paternal note. "What's been going on?" "I told you what's been going on," said Gatsby. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. "Not saying," said Gatsby. "No. We couldn't meet. But both of us loved each other all that time. Old sport. And you didn't know." "Oh, that's all." Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. "You're crazy," he exploded. "I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago, because I didn't know Daisy thin, and I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a goddamn lie." "No," said Gatsby, shaking his head. "She does. Though the trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing." He nodded sagely. "And what's more, I love Daisy too. Once in a while I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back." "You're revolting," said Daisy. She turned to me, and her voice, dropping an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. "Do you know why we left Chicago?" Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. "Daisy, that's all over now," he said earnestly. "It doesn't matter anymore." She looked at him blindly. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realised at last what she was doing, and as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. "I never loved him," she said, with perceptible reluctance. "Not at Capillani?" demanded Tom suddenly, from the ballroom beneath. Muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. "Please don't." Her voice was cold, but the rancour was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. "There." She said by her hand as she tried to light a cigarette was trembling. Suddenly she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. "Oh, you want too much," she cried to Gatsby. "I love you now, isn't that enough?" "I can't help what's past." She began to sob helplessly. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You love me too, he repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there's things between Daisy and me that you'll never know. The words seemed to bite physically into Gatsby. I want to speak to Daisy alone, he insisted. Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. Of course it wouldn't, agreed Tom. She turned to her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it matters. You don't understand, said Gatsby, with a touch of panic. I'm not? Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now. I am. Though she said with a visible effort. She's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Well, who are you? Anyhow, broke out Tom. You're one of that bunch that hangs around with Mayor Wolfsham at that match I happened to. Oh, you can suit yourself about that. Old sport, said Gatsby steadily. I found out what your drugstores were. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. He and this Wolfsham bought up a lot of side street drugstores here in Chicago and sold greying alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bit like the first time I saw him. What about it, said Gatsby politely. And you left him in the lurch. Didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God. He came to us dead broke. He was very glad to pick up some money. Don't you call me old sport, cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. Water could have you up on the betting laws too. That unfamiliar yet recognisable look was back again in Gatsby's face. That drugstore business was just small change, continued Tom slowly. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked in this said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his gardeners. If he had called a man, for a moment the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily and despairingly toward that lost face across the room. The voice began to go. Please, Tom. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone. You just start on home. Daisy, said Tom. I missed it. She looked at Tom. Now. But he insisted with magnanimous scorn. Go on. He won't deny you. They were gone. Without a word. Snapped out. Made accidental. Isolated. Like ghosts. Even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in. The towel. Want any of this stuff? I didn't answer. Dick, he asked again. I was 30. Before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe with him and started for On Island. Tom talked incessantly. exulting and laughing. But his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the front climb on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments favour the city lights. Behind 30th promise of a decade of loneliness. A thinning list of single men to know. A thinning briefcase of enthusiasm. Thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me, who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her one face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her. And so we drove on toward it through the cooling twilight. The young Greek, Michaelis, who ran the coffee drink beside the sheeps, was the principal witness at the inquest. He had slept through the heat until after 5, when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office, really sick, pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying that he'd miss a lot of business if he did, while his neighbour was trying to persuade him. A violent racket broke out overhead. "I've got my wife locked up there," explained Wilson calmly. "She's going to stay there till the day after tomorrow." Michaelis was astonished. They had been neighbours for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed faintly capable of such a statement. Generally, he was one of these worn-out men. When he wasn't working, he sat on a chair in the doorway and stared at the people in the cars that passed along the road. When anyone spoke to him, he invariably laughed in an agreeable, colourless way. He was his wife's man and not his own. So naturally, Michaelis tried to find out what had happened. But Wilson wouldn't say a word. Instead, he began to throw curious, suspicious glances at his visitor and ask him what he'd been doing at certain times, on certain days, just as the latter was getting uneasy. Some workmen came past the door bound for his restaurant, and Michaelis took the opportunity to get away, intending to come back later. But he didn't. He supposed he forgot to. That's all. When he came outside again, a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Miss Wilson's voice loud and scolding downstairs in the garage. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "For me down and beat me." A moment later, she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting before he could move from his door. The business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. However, Michaelis wasn't even sure of its colour. Told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond, and its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the wood and mingled her thick dark blood with the dust. Michaelis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirt waist, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped a little at the corners, as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. "We, sir." The 3 or 4 automobiles and the crowd when we were still some distance away. Said Tom. "That's good." He slowed down, but still without any intention of stopping until, as we came nearer the hush intent faces of the people at the garage door, made him automatically put on the brakes. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully. I became aware now of a hollow, wailing sound which issued insistently from the garage, a sound which, as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door resolved itself into the words, "Oh my God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "There's some bad." "Trouble here," said Tom excitedly. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow lighting. A swinging metal basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat, and with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. The new arrivals deranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly inside. Myrtle Wilson's body wrapped in a blanket, and then in another blanket, as though she suffered from a chill in the hot night, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it, motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman taking down names with much sweat and correction in a little book. At first I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bright garages, and I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the dupus with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a loud voice, and attempting from time to time to lay a hand on his shoulder. But Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the leaden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again, and he gave out incessantly his high, horrible call. "Well, my God. Oh, my God. Oh, God. Well." Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk, and, after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a mumbled, incoherent remark to the policeman. And maybe the policeman was saying, "No," or corrected the man. "Listen to me," muttered Tom. "There's or," said the policeman. He looked up as Tom's bored hand fell sharply on his shoulder. "What you want?" Otto hit her, instantly called, repeated Tom, stirring. She ran out in a road. There was 2 cars, said Michaelese, one coming, one going. "Going where?" asked the policeman keenly. "On. Going each way." Well, Shahai's hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. I ran out there in the one coming from Zaraknock. Right into her. "What's the name of this place here?" demanded the officer. Pale, well-dressed Negro stepped near. "It was a yellow car," he said. "Big yellow car." "See the accident?" asked the policeman. "No, but the car passed me. Down the road, going faster as 40. Going 50, come here and let's have your name. Book out now." Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly anything found voice among his grasping cries. "You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was." Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and, standing in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms. "You've got to pull yourself together," he said with soothing gruffness. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He started up on his tiptoes and then would have collapsed to his knees had not Tom held him upright. "Listen," said Tom, shaking him a little. "I just got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine, do you hear?" Only the Negro and I were near enough to hear what he said, but the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. "What's all that?" he demanded. "I'm a friend of his." Tom turned his head back, kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at him. "It's a blue car. We've come straight from New York," I said. Someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away, now picking up Wilson like a doll. Tom carried him into the office, set him down in a chair, and came back. "If somebody will come here and sit with him," he snapped furtively. watched while the two men standing closest glanced at each other and went unwillingly into their room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered self-consciously, with his authoritative arms breaking the way we pushed through the still gathering crowd, passing a hurried doctor, case in hand, who had been sent for in Wild Hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend. The thinness whip came down hard and the coupe raced on through the night. In a little while I heard a low husky sob, and saw that the tears were overflowing down his face. "The goddamn card," he whimpered. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark rustling trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor, where two windows bloomed with light among the vines. "Daisy's home," he said. As we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. "I ought to have dropped you a Mestigonic." A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely and with decision. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. "I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home, and while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper for you. Want any?" He opened the door. "Well, thanks, but I'd be glad if you'd order me the taxi." Jordan put her hand on my arm. "Won't you come in?" "No, I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone." But Jordan lingered for a moment more. "It's only 9:30, she said. "I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day," and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name and Gatsby step from between two bushes into the path. I must have felt pretty weird by that time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. "What are you doing?" I inquired. "Just standing here." Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house. In a moment, I wouldn't have been surprised to see sinister faces, the faces of Walsham's people behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. He hesitated. "I thought so," I told Daisy. "I thought so. It's better that the shocks should all come at once." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. "I got to wested by a side road," he went on, and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us. I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. "Who was the woman?" he inquired. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage." Well, I tried to swing the wheel. He broke off, and suddenly I guessed at the truth. "Yes," he said after a moment, "but of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her to drive, and this woman rushed at us just as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, thought we were somebody she knew. Well, first Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, and then she lost her nerve and turned back. "Don't tell me, old sport." He winced. I heard as he stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't. So I pulled on the emergency brake. Then she fell over into my lap and I drove on. "She'll be all right tomorrow," he said presently. "And just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about that. I'm business this afternoon." She's locked herself into her room. He won't touch her. I said, I don't trust him all night if necessary. Anyhow, a new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection and it might. Think anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the ground floor. You wait. Here, I said. I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel swiftly and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open and I saw that the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the alien. Yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I had left him in the drive. Is it all quiet up there? He asked anxiously. Yes, it's all quiet. Hesitated. He shook his head. I want to wait here till Daisy goes there. Bed. Good night. He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight watching over nothing. To be continued.